This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a doctoral fellow at the Ben-Gurion Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, whose work focuses on the construction of the Israeli national narrative in the early state years and also beyond. Adi Sherzer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello. Nice to be here.
So the construction of the Israeli national narrative is particularly interesting because Zionism, that provided the ideological underpinning to this process, was revolutionary and reactionary at the same time. That is, looking to re-establish a political entity that's long gone on the one hand, but at the same time, one that is radically progressive. And in your research, you chose to focus on the first Independence Day celebrations as an indicative case study. So what can you tell us about this dialectical process, and what light does the Independence Day celebration shed on it?
Okay, so maybe we'll start with the regular way that Israeli historiography used to look at things, because for many years, historians and sociologists in the Israeli academic arena used to treat to the Israeli identity as a totally new identity. In the words of Moshe Shamir, a very interesting author at the 50s, as someone who came from the sea, that has no past, and from many perspectives is disconnected from the galut, disconnected from the exile and from the all kinds of traditions and rituals. However, recent studies, and my study is not the only one who try to look at things differently. Recent studies shows that the relationship between the Israeli identity and the Jewish identity is far more complex and tend to be much more close than we originally thought.
Yeah, but at the same time, even the early Zionists didn't believe that they were creating something out of nowhere. I mean, it all related to the scriptures, to the old Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. It wasn't. All these weren't just random choices.
Of course, there wasn't. But yet, if you would ask many Israeli scholars who looked at the kibbutzim or even looked at the deeds of Israeli main political figures such as Ben-Gurion, they highlighted the secular and modern part of their deeds. In other words, if Ben-Gurion during the 50s and 60s opened a special Bible class at his home, what was the thing that researchers used to focus was the secular and geographical perspective of those Bible lessons. However, if you would ask me, I would highlight the basic fact that they did focus on the Bible, and they did read many traditional commemorators over the Bible. So it depends on the way that you look at this.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that exactly? How, according to you, the relationship between the new Israel ethos and the old diasporic one, how did this relationship become redefined?
Well, first of all, this case, such as on other cases, pictures tend to be much more colorful and much less monochromatic than we used to think. What I mean to say is that we cannot talk about a total rejection of any kind. We cannot talk about the rejection of exilic life. However, we can talk, and we should talk, about new interpretation to Judaism who focus on other parts of the identity. But exile and exilic rituals and exilic traditions were there in the 50s. I will give you an interesting example from another arena, which is folk dancing. Folk dancing could be an interesting example because folk dancing are considered to be as one of the most prominent Israeli symbols.
You mean horror?
I mean horror and others. But if you would look about the main figures in the study of folk dancing in the 50s, because one of the big missions of those people was to teach the new immigrants and to teach the public those new dances. So if you would look about those figures and if you would look about it on the dances themselves, you would see that those dances draw inspiration from Yemenite, from Hasidic, and other sources of inspiration who were exilic and it wasn't invented in the land of Israel. It wasn't disconnected from what happened before. It did change, and this change is one of the most important processes that I'm trying to focus on, because the question, what do you take and what do you throw? What kind of values would you like to get out of those?
How do you construct tradition?
Okay, so first of all, every society, and even the most revolutionary society, has its own relevant tradition. So even if we would look at, let's say, the French society after the French Revolution or the Soviet society after the Soviet Revolution, both of them has their own relevant past, has their own relevant tradition. In this case is the revolution itself. However, if you would compare those cases into the Israeli cases, you would find some interesting things. And the calendar and the holiday cycle could be a nice example to explain it. Because unlike the case, not like the case in the French example, in which the French Revolution leaders and thinkers fundamentally changed the calendar, erased all the holidays, all the ritual system, and kind of the same thing happened in the Soviet case. In the Israeli case, we can see something different. We can see a different dialect, because the Zionist leaders sought to change the holiday cycle, not to erase it, to revise it in many ways.
The calendar remained intact, but the content of it became different, right? So
I won't say so, because the basic content is the same. If you would look, for example, at Passover, so the basic content remained the same. The basic content is the story of people that go out of Egypt. What changed is the interpretation. So the basics are the same, and the interpretation gets a little bit different.
That all feeds into the construction or the reconstruction of a national home for the Jews.
Yes. So what you can actually argue is that Israeli memory agents use Passover and other holidays. It was a way to help them to construct this kind of new identity, to strengthen the ideas of liberty and reestablishing the state.
But before we get to the independence state, which is a particularly interesting case study, I'd like you to explain just briefly what are memory agents and how do they operate?
So when we're talking, first of all, memory agents, when I'm talking about memory agents, I mean memory agents in the terms of Pierre Nora, which is a French sociologist and the author of a very prominent series of books who focus on French and national memory and national rituals. So while we're talking about memory agents, we talk about those. We're talking about those institutes and those political leaders that has the power to implement the narrative, to implement the ethos into daily life. So if we're talking about memory agents in the Israeli case, we can talk about the IDF, for example, or we can talk about the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Agriculture, or we can talk about the JNF. Each one of these memory agents had the power to implement the ideas of the new nationality, the ideas of the new ideas of Zionism and Israelism into day-to-day life of different groups.
Mm-hmm. But you can say that pretty much about any government agent, right? They do something.
Yes,
they prioritize their policy in a way that would assist the the general. I don't know if we call it narrative, but
the differences between the up-to-date Israel and the 50s Israel is the fact that on the 50s, this mission to implement the narrative, to implement Zionist ideas, was far more important and far more on the table. So if you would talk with, let's say, an officer, a high-rank officer at the IDF, at the 50s and today, I guess that even today, the implementing of the narrative would be something that he finds important. But back then, back in the 50s, it was very clear that that was one of his main missions.
Mm-hmm. To educate the masses,
yes,
in a way. So how does the Independence Day... How do Independence Day celebrations feed into all this? So why did you choose to focus on them? And is it because, and this is just a hypothesis here, that unlike other holidays, this is really, Independence Day is the only secular holiday that we have in this country. And therefore, the failure of Independence Day or the re-establishment or the redefinition of Independence Day as some kind of fitting in the grand scheme of the great history of the Jewish holiday is a case in point.
I chose to focus on the Independence Day because I had a feeling that the story that we used to being told about the Israeli history is not that precise. The things that I mentioned earlier, I had the feeling that no one actually came from the sea. And I looked for the most Israeli movement. And in this especially Israeli movement, in this particular Israeli movement, I tried to find the traces of Jewish tradition. So that's how I came to the Independence Day. But while reading about it and while watching movies from the Independence Day in the 50s, because this is one of the most interesting things that you can find there, I came into some interesting understandings about the role of the Independence Day in Israel in the 50s and today. During the 50s, the Independence Day wasn't a distant memory. It was a vivid memory of people who actually had the option to remember themselves when the state was established. So in many ways,
or to imagine the alternative.
Or to imagine the alternative, yes. So in many ways, they commemorate themselves. They didn't commemorate their fathers. They didn't commemorate the state leaders who are not here anymore. They commemorate themselves.
Or the Israelites or the Maccabees or whatever.
Yeah. However, when you look at the Independence Day during the ages, when you go through the years, you can find that the Independence Day had changed a lot because of that. Because this kind of very authentic feeling is not there anymore. However, in the 50s, it was there. And this is why I found it extremely interesting, because that was a holiday of the people, that people could actually feel themselves as part of. They celebrated themselves.
But there was a few attempts to instill some kind of Jewish religious content into Independence Day, the way that they did the other way around with the other holidays, instilling Israeli content into an essentially religious holiday.
Yes, so in this manner, we can talk about two different approaches to implementing Jewish traditions into the Independence Day. One of them is the Orthodox attempt to make the Independence Day as part of the Jewish holiday cycle. And this is extremely interesting because it's not relevant only to Orthodox. If you would look on the discussion at the Israeli parliament, at the Knesset, before the first Independence Day in 1949, you could see that most of the Knesset members thought that they are going to start a Jewish holiday, not an Israeli holiday, but a Jewish holiday. By the way, this is the reason why they chose to date it according to the Hebrew calendar, not according to the Gregorian calendar. And there was an interesting discussion about it. So if you would look at this attempt, and you will go again throughout the years, you could see that the chief rabbinate in Israel made lots of efforts in order to implement it as a Jewish holiday. And during the first years of state, you could see the main political leaders. You could see David Ben-Gurion. You could see others who are going to synagogues in the night of the holiday. And not only that Ben-Gurion went to the Yeshurun synagogue in Jerusalem, it was also extremely important for him that his political newspaper, Davar, would publish it on the first pages of the newspaper.
Very interesting.
But I have an interesting anecdote about it, which in many ways catched a lot of the problems about it. And this anecdote happened in 1952. Golda Meir, who was a minister at the government at the time, didn't went to the synagogue, and other ministers, other religious ministers, saw it as some kind of
blasphemy.
Yeah, or a secular statement. So before the Independence Day of 1952, the welfare minister from the Mafdal, from the religious party, told Golda Meir in the entrance of the Knesset, he told her, "Dear Golda, not only in Moscow you have synagogues, you also have synagogues in Jerusalem."
Exactly. Because when you said about Ben-Gurion, it's just like, for him, Independence Day was just like any other holiday, even perhaps more important because it was a secular man.
Yes, but the point is, and the answer of Golda Meir catch the problem of it, because Golda Meir answered to him, "If you would let me sit on the first seats, on the first floor, between the men, as I sat in Moscow, I would definitely come."
Mm-hmm.
So, in many ways, this is part of the traditional holiday cycle, but it's not a traditional holiday. It's a modern holiday, and it's a modern holiday for secular people, and those secular people are the ones who have to implement it.
Okay.
So here I come to the other way that other memory agents try to implement Judaism into the Independence Day, and those are the ideas of Ben-Zion Dinur. Ben-Zion Dinur, the education minister, and in many ways the state historian of Israel, is also the founder of Yad Vashem, and he's the founder of Israeli public education system, and he has many other rights.
And also the founder of the School of Israel Studies at
in many ways,
right?
yes.
The whole discipline.
In the Hebrew University, yes. So what Ben-Zion Dinur did was extremely interesting, because unlike Ben-Gurion, who said, okay, inside the Independence Day rituals, I want to preserve a specific square into the Jewish rituals, Ben-Zion Dinur tried to do something different. He tried to mix things up and to invent, in many ways, a Jewish modern tradition. And then he had some really interesting, though weird ideas, such as the idea of making an Haggadah, an historic epos, to the Independence Day, such as a Kiddush for the Independence Days.
Why didn't it catch on?
Why didn't it catch on? Well, for two reasons. First of all, people saw it as a bit artificial. And another problem, which was much more problematic, is the problem, how can you articulate a specific narrative in such a vivid and multicolored society? Because if you're writing an Haggadah, if you're writing an epos, you have to be very specific. You have to tell a story. You cannot ignore a story, and you cannot tell something that is too general. And in this way, what Ben-Gurion Dinur wrote was problematic for both sides, because seculars saw it as too traditional. And on the other hand, religious people and the religious parties saw it as blasphemy. So that was the main problem, because on the 50s we're talking about a society who try to have a very wide consensus. And in order to be part of this consensus, you cannot be too specific. And Ben-Gurion Dinur was too specific.
Which is, in a way, the whole problem of Zionism in a nutshell, isn't it? How do you really square the circle between, as we said, the connection to the past and the desire to reinvent yourself?
Yes, I would say in many ways this is one of the main examples in which you can implement your findings on the Independence Day on other parts of Israeli history.
Yes, and why it is so indicative. But I'm afraid, Adi Sherzer, that this is all we have time for. Thank you very much for coming in today and talking to us about the construction of the Israeli national narrative through the case study of the early Independence Day celebrations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
In the middle of all night, a star so far on the sidewalk of my mind. So far star from eve to dawn, I will go for him, surrendered and blind into his arms on mine. 'Cause every time I look